God bless the reading and the hearing of the portions of the word which have been read this morning. The passage you just heard is an interlude between the 9th and 10th plagues that God brought upon the nation of Egypt. And 8 chapters have transpired since last Sunday's reading. So clearly I need to bring you up to date with what's been going on in Egypt. Last week we looked at the burning bush story where God called Moses to be his agent to go back to Egypt and bring the Hebrew slaves out of slavery into freedom. Due to Moses' objections about all of his different inadequacies, God agreed to send his brother Aaron with him to be his spokesman. So Moses took his wife and sons, met Aaron on the way, and together they went back to Egypt. They went first to the Hebrew people, their own people. They got the leaders of the Hebrew people together and told them what had happened and told them about the Lord's plans for them and performed those signs that God had given them, the staff turning into the snake and the hand becoming leprous and then being cleansed. And the Hebrew people believed them. And they bowed down to worship the God who had heard their cries and decided to act on their behalf. So the first obstacle for Moses was overcome, that he had no or little credibility with the Hebrew people due to having grown up with all the privileges of Pharaoh's household. But as with so many things, just because it started out well and easily did not mean everything went easily. The next stop was Pharaoh's office, where Moses and Aaron did manage to get an audience with Pharaoh. Now, a side note, remember that the Pharaoh who had ruled while Moses was growing up in the palace had died. Now, I would assume that the new Pharaoh was a son of the old Pharaoh, and thus that he and Moses would have known each other growing up, but there is no evidence of that one way or the other in the Bible. Anyway, they came before Pharaoh with this message. Thus says Yahweh, the Lord of Israel, let my people go, so that they may celebrate a festival to me in the wilderness. Pharaoh replied, who is Yahweh, that I should heed him and let Israel go? I do not know this Yahweh, and I will not let Israel go. Yahweh, of course, was the name that God had recently given to Moses at the burning bush. Pharaoh would never have heard that name among all the names of gods he had heard. And he had no reason to fear the consequences if he did not do what was asked. And really and truly, as far as he could see, the Israelites had no God that exhibited any power on their behalf. So not only did Pharaoh not grant the request of Moses and Aaron, he told the taskmasters from that point forward to double down on the slaves. No more would straw be provided for them for the making of bricks that they had to do every day. They would have to go out and find the straw on their own, yet their quota of making bricks for every day would not be reduced at all. They figured working harder would take their minds off wanting to follow Moses out for this religious meeting. Well, when the slaves began experiencing this harsh new reality, they were naturally very angry at Moses and Aaron for bringing it on them. All they had done was make their lives worse and harder. So Moses took that to God and had a complaint with him. He said, why are you mistreating these people? Why did you even send me here? Since you sent me here, their lot has gotten worse. And listen to this complaint. And you have done nothing at all to deliver them. You have done nothing. God told him to hang on because he was getting ready to see some good stuff. He told him first what to say to encourage the slaves but they were not buying it this time. So at this point, the plagues began. 9 times Moses and Aaron came before Pharaoh, asking him to let them take the Israelites to the wilderness for a religious festival. Each time he says no, and each time they institute a plague from God. Each plague is very bad, and after a little while, Pharaoh calls them back in and asks them to pray to Yahweh to remove this plague, and then he will let the people go to worship. Each time they do so, and the plague is removed, but Pharaoh always changes his mind and decides not to let them go after the plague ends. At some places in this account, it says that God hardened the heart of Pharaoh so that he would not let them go. At other places, it says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. I personally believe that Pharaoh was making his own decisions. God mercifully gave him 9 chances before finally coming to the fatal solution, which was the language of the Egyptian empire, the language of death. The empire, which had not thought twice about the killing of male Hebrew babies and throwing them into the river, would never change unless it was visited with the same kind of devastation. So after the 9th plague was ended, God had Moses warn Pharaoh what the 10th plague would be if he did not allow the Israelites to go as requested. The 10th plague would be that the firstborn of every Egyptian family and animal would die. And Moses said, "Then all of your officials and all of your people are going to beg us to leave and to take everything with us." Pharaoh still refused to budge. But I don't find that surprising, do you? He was operating under the "if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile" mindset. And how could Egypt operate without slave labor? And how could slave labor be counted upon without total domination and submission? That's the mindset of leaders of empires, whether they be political or financial or religious or whatever. Any change to the status quo, any change to the authority structure, to the minimum wage, to the distribution of wealth, and the whole thing might come toppling down. All kinds of warning signs may be ignored with the hope that we can just get through our watch without anything changing. But sweeping all of those warnings under the carpet and grinding the heel down harder just assures a more catastrophic event to come, as Pharaoh is about to learn the hard way. He's been given one chance after another to do the right thing, but now he's truly going to learn who this Yahweh is and why he should fear him. And the Hebrews are truly going to learn who this Yahweh is and why they should serve him. During the interlude of today's reading, God turns to this task. He instructs Moses and Aaron both how to prepare for that night's events and how to commemorate those events in the future. Each household is to slaughter a lamb. If the family's too small to eat a whole lamb on its own, it should join with another family so that there'll be nothing left. There will be no opportunity to eat leftovers. Some of the blood of the lamb is to be sprinkled on the lintel and the doorpost of each home. It's the sign for the Lord to pass over these homes and not afflict them with the death of the firstborn. They're to roast the lamb, and they're to eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They're to eat it in a hurry. They're to wear their sandals and have their staffs in their hands. When Moses and Aaron gave them all of these instructions, the Hebrews bowed down and worshiped, and then they went and did exactly as they had been told. And sure enough, when midnight came and the angel of death passed over, great lamentation and cries arose over all of Egypt, even in the household of Pharaoh. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and ordered them to leave immediately, and ordered them to take all the people and their livestock with them. The Egyptian people, who were the neighbors of the Hebrew people, urged them to leave quickly before all of them died. And so they left in haste in the middle of the night. We'll pick the story up there next week. But what I'd like to focus on out of today's story is how the seeds of remembrance are planted in the midst of our experiences. Memory is so important to us, both as individuals and collectively. Egypt's troubles in the Exodus story began with the fact that they lost an important memory. They forgot Joseph. The Pharaoh no longer remembered who he was or the role he played in the survival of their society, or the fact that Joseph's family was brought to live in Egypt as honored guests due to gratitude for his contributions. That memory had been lost, and the Hebrew people came to be seen by the Egyptians as outsiders, aliens, threats to Egyptian society. And when you see people that way, you begin to treat them that way. And when you treat them that way, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So God carefully outlines for Moses and Aaron the shape of the future, the heart of which is to be remembrance. The first thing he tells them is that the Hebrews are to begin marking time from this moment. The month of the Exodus is to become for them the first month of the year, the first month of the rest of their lives, if you will. Time begins with God's deliverance of Israel from bondage to freedom. Gerald Jansen has an insightful interpretation of this. He writes, "When Pharaoh is in charge of time, one's days become an endless repetition of wearisome toil that in time may seem to have been going on forever. Past and future are just limitless extensions of an intolerable present. Such a present spreads itself both into the past and into the future, with the result that memory and hope are turned into a growing mountain of pain and a lengthening shadow of despair." Passover celebrates Israel's experience of God's redemption, which turns the past into a fountain of celebration to which one can return annually in remembrance, and turns the future into an open prospect that one can anticipate in hope. Many people are still living on Pharaoh's time, seeing themselves trapped within a meaningless, repetitive cycle of doing the same things day after day with no prospect of change. They're in need of an exodus, a deliverance from that mindset into the life of the God who makes all things new. It's a shift from living in chronos time, the Greek word for time as you find it on a watch or on your calendar, to living in kairos time, which is the Greek word for the fullness of God's time in our lives. It's not measured or lived in the same way. Another important memory for the Hebrew people is to be in the slaughtering of the lamb and the placement of some of the blood on the doorpost of the home. It's a reminder that God's deliverance is costly. There is a price to be paid. And though we be powerless slaves or everyman members of society, God is paying attention. And God can bring down whatever power stands in the way of liberation. And then there's the whole remembered aspect of needing to be ready to move immediately when the Spirit says move. They didn't eat meals with their sandals on, with their robes girded up, with their staff in their hand, but this is how they're supposed to eat the Passover, because you might have to leave in a hurry. You might need to just get up from the table and go. Jansen says this observance memorializes the way in which Israel had to flee Egypt quickly, before they even had time to put yeast in the bread dough. What might this mean in the lives of later generations? For one thing, it signifies that God's deliverance, which sometimes seems as though it will never come, can then come so quickly there's no time to prepare for it. One just picks up what one has at hand and moves forward in haste. The Passover thus becomes an annual sacred meal for Israel, which has significance in every element of it. And that the Passover meal is still celebrated 3,000 years later is testimony to the power of such sacred meals to keep memory alive. Egypt had forgotten Joseph in 430 years. The people of Yahweh have not forgotten his name or how he brought his people out of Egypt with a mighty hand and wonders 3,000 years later. We all know about this practice in our own lives. We celebrate special birthday meals to remember and give thanks for our loved ones whose lives began on that particular day. We celebrate special anniversary meals to remember and give thanks for the beginning of our marriages and families. We celebrate a Thanksgiving meal together, remembering the Pilgrims and the Indians and their coming together at the end of a very difficult year to be grateful together. And we remember in this place another meal that was actually a celebration of Passover, when Jesus and his disciples had their Last Supper together. It was the beginning of a new act of deliverance by God, and words were said that night about how it should be remembered. This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. This is my blood, the cup of the new covenant, poured out for the forgiveness of sins. As often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you remember and proclaim my death until I come again. And the next day, the body of Jesus was broken, and his blood was shed for a new exodus, a new deliverance from sin and from death. God's deliverance continues to be costly. How easy it is to forget when we get caught up in the day-to-day pressures of working for the Pharaoh, overseeing the workers, making sure production stays high and quality is good and profits are healthy, scrounging around for straw and quarreling with co-workers and resenting authority and fearing the underlings. How easy it is to ignore the signs and the warnings and keep plowing ahead into dangerous territory where God has clearly told us not to go. How easy it is to pray for help when the plagues come into our lives and then go our merry way with no changes when the plague is gone. People who want to live in the light know the importance of remembering who they are and whose they are. We are Yahweh's people. He brought us out of slavery with a mighty hand. He brought us out of exile in Babylon when it looked impossible. He brought us out of sin and despair by sending his Son to save us. Perhaps he has brought us individually out of some catastrophe when it seemed impossible. This is a God who delivers in this way, not just once, but time after time after time. So remember that. Eat sacred meals together. Tell the stories to your children and to your grandchildren. Put the symbols up where you'll be reminded every day. Mark time by these events, remember. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.